She was untouched and terrified, but the billionaire made her feel like a queen that night. Before we explore all the details of this incredible story, tell us where you're following us from and the time. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing, and let's embark on this journey together. The rain drummed against the windows of Naomi Ellington's studio apartment like an impatient visitor she wasn't ready to receive. She stood before her small bedroom mirror, holding a black dress that had been hanging unworn in her closet for 2 years. The fabric felt foreign between her fingers, too elegant, too bold for someone who preferred to blend into coffee shop corners and library alcoves. At 29, Naomi had perfected the art of being present without being seen, of listening without revealing, of existing in the comfortable shadows of other people's conversations. But tonight was different. Tonight, she had an obligation she couldn't escape. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, embossed with gold letters that caught the light mockingly. "You are cordially invited to the Meridian Foundation Gala." Her colleague Bethany had pressed it into her hands with the enthusiasm of someone who believed that networking events could change lives. "You need this, Naomi," Bethany had insisted, adjusting her own bright red lipstick in the break-room mirror at the small marketing firm where they both worked. "You can't keep hiding behind your computer screen forever. There will be important people there. Publishers, business owners, maybe even some film producers." Naomi had wanted to explain that she wasn't hiding exactly. She was just careful, selective. After what happened with David 3 years ago, the way he had made promises about their future while secretly planning his exit, she had learned that visibility often came with a price she wasn't willing to pay. But the invitation had come with a catch. Her boss, Mr. Hartford, had specifically requested that she attend as the company's representative. "You understand our clients' needs better than anyone," he'd said, and Naomi knew it wasn't really a request. Now, as thunder rolled across the Portland skyline, she slipped into the dress and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. The black fabric hugged her curves in ways that felt both flattering and exposing, and her dark hair fell in natural waves past her shoulders. She looked elegant, sophisticated, everything she felt she wasn't. The Grand Meridian Hotel downtown buzzed with energy that seemed to vibrate through the marble floors. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across faces that belonged in magazines, and the gentle clink of champagne glasses created a soundtrack of success and ambition. Naomi clutched her small purse tighter and reminded herself that she only needed to stay for 2 hours, shake the right hands, smile at the right moments, and then return to the safety of her quiet apartment. She accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and positioned herself near a tall window overlooking the city. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets below glistening under streetlights like a painting she might have admired from a safe distance. Not a fan of champagne, or just not a fan of crowds. The voice came from her left, deep, unhurried, with the kind of warmth that made her turn before she could stop herself. The man standing beside her was tall without being imposing, with sandy brown hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it once or twice. His suit was well-tailored but not flashy, and his eyes, a striking blue-gray, held the same observant quality she recognized in herself. "Both, actually," Naomi heard herself say, surprising them both with her honesty. He smiled, and it reached his eyes in a way that made her stomach flutter with something she hadn't felt in years. "Lysander Cole," he said, extending his hand, "and you're either the most honest person in this room or the most refreshingly direct." "Naomi," she replied, feeling the warmth of his palm against hers. "Naomi Ellington. And I'm probably both." They stood there for a moment longer than social convention required, hands still connected, eyes holding a conversation that neither of them could quite translate into words. Around them, the gala continued its sophisticated dance, but Naomi felt as if the volume had been turned down, as if the whole world had suddenly become more manageable. When Lysander finally released her hand, she felt the absence of his touch like a question she didn't know how to answer. And in that moment, Naomi realized that some invitations, the ones that mattered most, came disguised as simple introductions on rainy Thursday nights. Have you ever met someone who made you question everything you thought you knew about staying safe? Someone whose simple presence made your carefully built walls feel both necessary and suffocating at the same time? She told herself it was just another Tuesday morning ritual. Naomi pushed through the glass door of Brood Awakening, the small coffee shop 3 blocks from her apartment that had become her sanctuary over the past 2 years. The familiar scent of freshly ground beans and warm pastries wrapped around her like a comfort blanket, and she felt her shoulders relax for the first time since Saturday night's gala. 3 days had passed since she'd met Lysander Cole, and she'd spent each one trying to convince herself that the flutter in her chest had been nothing more than champagne bubbles and social anxiety. Men like him, confident, charming, effortlessly magnetic, didn't linger in the lives of women like her. They collected phone numbers at elegant events and moved on to their next adventure. She hadn't given him her number, hadn't even mentioned where she worked or lived. It had been a perfect, contained moment. Beautiful, precisely because it would never happen again. "The usual, hun," called out Meredith, the 60-something barista whose grey curls always seemed to defy gravity in the most endearing way. "Please," Naomi replied, settling into her favourite corner table by the window. She pulled out her laptop and notebook, ready to lose herself in the marketing proposal that was due by Friday. This was her element: quiet productivity, steaming coffee, and the gentle hum of other people's conversations, providing a soundtrack to her solitude. She was 3 pages deep in demographic analysis when a shadow fell across her table. "I was hoping it wasn't just coincidence that we both prefer small places over corporate chains." Naomi's fingers stilled on the keyboard. That voice, warm honey with just a hint of gravel, was unmistakable. She looked up to find Lysander standing beside her table, holding a simple white ceramic mug and wearing a smile that seemed genuinely surprised. He was different in daylight, less polished than he'd been at the gala, wearing dark jeans and a navy sweater that made his blue-grey eyes more pronounced. His hair was slightly mussed, as if he'd walked here through the October breeze, and there was something wonderfully real about seeing him without the formal backdrop of crystal chandeliers and evening wear. "Lysander," she said, hoping her voice sounded more composed than she felt. "What are the odds? In a city of 650,000 people? Pretty astronomical." He gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Mind if I sit, or would you prefer to keep this a mysterious one-time encounter?" Naomi found herself nodding before her practical mind could intervene. "I suppose the mystery is already ruined," she said, closing her laptop halfway. "Though I have to ask, do you make a habit of finding women from fancy parties in random coffee shops? Only the ones who tell me they're not fans of crowds and then proceed to have the most honest conversation I've had in months." He settled into the chair with the same unhurried grace she remembered from Saturday night. "And for the record, this isn't exactly random. I live about 6 blocks from here. This is my Tuesday morning routine." "Tuesday morning routine," Naomi repeated, feeling something warm unfurl in her chest. "How very ordinary of you." "Disappointed?" "Relieved," she admitted, then immediately wondered why she'd been so honest again. Lysander's smile deepened. "Good. Because I have a confession. I was hoping I'd see you again, but I had no idea how to make that happen without seeming like a stalker. The universe apparently decided to help me out." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each sipping their coffee while stealing glances at the other. Naomi noticed the way he wrapped both hands around his mug, as if savoring the warmth. She noticed the small scar above his left eyebrow, and wondered what story it held. Most of all, she noticed that being observed by him didn't feel invasive or uncomfortable. It felt like being seen. "What were you working on so intently when I interrupted?" he asked, nodding toward her laptop. "Marketing proposal for a sustainable clothing company," Naomi replied. "Not exactly riveting conversation material." "Try me." Something in his tone made her believe he actually meant it. So she found herself explaining the challenges of reaching environmentally conscious consumers without sounding preachy, the delicate balance between authenticity and profit, the way good marketing could change behaviors without feeling manipulative. Lysander listened with the kind of attention that felt rare in a world of constant distractions. He asked thoughtful questions, made connections she hadn't considered, and somehow managed to make her work sound more interesting than she'd ever thought it was. "You light up when you talk about it," he observed, after she'd finished explaining her strategy for the campaign. "I do not," Naomi protested, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "You do. Your whole face changes, like you forget to be careful for a minute." The comment hit closer to home than she expected. Careful. Yes, that was exactly what she'd been for the past 3 years. Careful with her heart, careful with her trust, careful with hope itself. "And what about you?" she asked, deflecting. "What do you do when you're not crashing other people's coffee shop routines?" "I design spaces," he said simply. "Residential mostly, some commercial. I help people figure out how they want to live, then create environments that support that vision." "That sounds—" Naomi paused, searching for the right word. Personal. It is. You'd be surprised how much people reveal about themselves when they're talking about their dream kitchen or the perfect reading nook. He tilted his head slightly. Speaking of which, this corner table tells me you value observation over participation, prefer natural light and like having your back to the wall so you can see everything happening around you. Naomi felt exposed and impressed in equal measure. That's either very insightful or mildly concerning. Occupational hazard, Lysander said with a laugh. I notice how people inhabit spaces. It's not personal. Well, usually it isn't. Before Naomi could ask what he meant by that, her phone buzzed with a text from Bethany. Client meeting moved to 10:30. Where are you? Reality crashed back in. She glanced at the time, 9:45 a.m. She'd been talking to Lysander for over an hour, and it had felt like minutes. I have to go, she said, already packing up her laptop. Work calls. Of course. Lysander stood as she did, and for a moment they were close enough that she could smell his cologne, something clean and understated. Naomi? She looked up at him, heart hammering against her ribs. I hope the universe keeps being helpful with these coincidences. And as she walked out into the crisp October morning, Naomi realized that for the first time in 3 years, she hoped so too. The universe, it seemed, had developed a sense of humor. Naomi spotted him before he saw her, a familiar figure in a charcoal grey jacket, moving at an unhurried pace along the tree-lined path of Laurelhurst Park. It was Thursday morning, barely past 7, and the October air carried that crisp promise of winter that made her pull her burgundy scarf tighter around her neck. She'd started taking these early morning walks 2 weeks ago, craving movement and fresh air before diving into the demands of her workday. The park at this hour belonged to dog walkers, joggers, and the occasional early bird seeking solitude among the changing leaves. It was supposed to be her time, quiet, predictable, safe. But there was Lysander Cole, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, studying the way morning light filtered through maple branches, like he was memorizing it for later use. Naomi slowed her pace, her heart doing that familiar skip and flutter dance that had become embarrassingly routine since Tuesday's coffee shop encounter. She could turn around, take the longer route back to her apartment, pretend this moment never happened. It would be the smart thing to do, the careful thing. Instead, she found herself walking faster. Either we're both creatures of habit, or Portland is much smaller than I thought, she called out when she was close enough to be heard without shouting. Lysander turned, and his face lit up with that genuine smile that seemed to rearrange something fundamental in her chest. Naomi, I was just thinking about how the light hits these trees differently every day, even though they're in the exact same spot. Deep thoughts for 7 in the morning, she said, falling into step beside him as naturally as if they'd planned this meeting. I'm an early riser. Always have been. They walked in comfortable silence for a few moments, their footsteps creating a gentle rhythm on the gravel path. My grandmother used to say that morning is when the world is most honest, before it puts on its daily mask. Your grandmother sounds wise. She was. Raised me after my parents died when I was 12. The words came out matter-of-factly, without self-pity, but Naomi felt the weight of them anyway. She taught me to notice things, the way light changes, how people move through spaces, what makes a house feel like home versus just a place to sleep. Naomi glanced at his profile, noting the slight tightness around his eyes that suggested old pain carefully managed. That's where your work comes from then, creating homes for people. Partly, yeah. Lysander picked up a fallen leaf, twirling it between his fingers as they walked. What about you? What got you into marketing? Practical necessity, mostly, Naomi admitted. I majored in English literature, which my mother helpfully pointed out was a lovely hobby but not a career. Marketing felt like a compromise, still working with words and stories, just selling things instead of exploring the human condition. Do you miss it? The exploring part? The question caught her off guard. Most people asked about her job satisfaction or career goals, not about the dreams she'd quietly set aside. Sometimes, she said softly, I used to write. Nothing published, just stories about ordinary people in extraordinary moments. But life got complicated, and practical concerns took over. What kind of complications? Naomi felt the familiar instinct to deflect, to keep her walls intact. But something about the early morning stillness, the way Lysander listened without pushing, made her want to be honest. I got engaged 3 years ago to someone who made a lot of promises about supporting my dreams. She kicked at a small stone, watching it skitter ahead of them. Turns out he was more interested in the idea of a creative girlfriend than the reality of a woman who spent evenings writing instead of planning dinner parties for his colleagues. Sounds like his loss was pretty catastrophic. The simple statement, delivered without drama or false sympathy, made Naomi smile despite herself. That's one way to put it. They'd reached the pond at the center of the park, where a few ducks glided across the surface with enviable serenity. Lysander stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Can I tell you something?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of seriousness that made her pulse quicken. "Sure." Tuesday morning at the coffee shop wasn't a coincidence. I mean, it was. I really do go there every Tuesday. But I'd been hoping to see you again since Saturday night. He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking younger and more vulnerable. I know that might sound forward, or maybe even a little creepy, but there was something about our conversation at the gala that I couldn't shake. Naomi felt her breath catch. What kind of something? You didn't try to impress me. You didn't laugh at my jokes unless they were actually funny. When I talked, you listened like my words mattered, not like you were waiting for your turn to speak. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the golden flecks in his blue-gray eyes. It's been a long time since someone made me feel like myself instead of like a version of myself. The honesty in his voice was almost overwhelming. Naomi felt the careful distance she'd maintained beginning to crack, and it terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "Lysander," she began, not sure what she wanted to say. "I know you're careful," he said gently. "I can see it in the way you choose your words, the way you hold yourself like you're ready to run if things get too intense. And I'm not asking you to change that. I'm just asking you to consider that maybe some risks are worth taking." Before she could respond, her phone buzzed insistently. Work, always work, pulling her back to the safe, predictable world where feelings could be managed and hearts could stay protected. "I should go," she said reluctantly, already reaching for her phone. "Naomi." Lysander's voice stopped her mid-turn. "Same time tomorrow." She looked back at him, standing there in the morning light with hope written across his features, and felt something inside her chest crack open just a little wider. "Same time tomorrow," she heard herself say, and wondered when she'd stopped being afraid of her own voice. The bookstore smelled like old paper and forgotten dreams. Naomi had discovered Powell's books during her first week in Portland, and it had quickly become her refuge on Saturday afternoons, when the world felt too loud and demanding. The towering shelves created intimate corridors where she could disappear for hours, running her fingers along worn spines and reading first paragraphs that promised escape. Today, she'd sought out the fiction section with particular purpose. Her conversation with Lysander about writing had awakened something she'd thought she'd successfully buried, the urge to lose herself in other people's stories, to remember what it felt like to believe in happily ever after. She was crouched in the literary fiction aisle, examining a collection of short stories about ordinary women in extraordinary circumstances, when a familiar voice drifted over the shelf behind her. "Excuse me, do you have anything by authors who understand that love stories don't always start with grand gestures?" Naomi froze, recognizing the voice immediately. Lysander was one aisle over, apparently talking to a store employee. She could hear the smile in his tone, that gentle humor that had become increasingly familiar over their morning walks. "Well," came the response from what sounded like a young male employee, "that depends on what you consider a grand gesture. Are we talking no dramatic airport scenes or no gestures at all? I'm thinking more everyday magic, the kind that happens in coffee shops and during morning walks. Stories about people who fall in love slowly, carefully, like they're learning a language they've never spoken before." Naomi's breath caught. Was he talking about them? Or was she reading meaning into innocent words because her own feelings had become so complicated that everything seemed to carry hidden messages? "Ah, you want the good stuff," the employee said with obvious approval. "Let me show you a few options." Naomi heard footsteps moving away and thought she was safe to continue browsing, but then Lysander's voice came from directly behind her. "Find anything interesting down there?" She looked up to find him standing at the end of the aisle, holding a small stack of books and wearing that expression of amused surprise that seemed to be his default whenever they encountered each other unexpectedly. "Are you following me now?" she asked, rising to her feet and brushing dust off her jeans. "Would you believe me if I said this was another cosmic coincidence? In a bookstore the size of a city block? Absolutely not." Lysander laughed, a sound that made something warm bloom in her chest, despite her attempted skepticism. "Fair enough. Full disclosure. I saw you through the window when I was walking by. You looked so completely absorbed in whatever you were reading that I had to come in and see what could capture Naomi Ellington's undivided attention. And instead you started asking the staff for relationship advice disguised as book recommendations? Touché. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the titles in his stack. 3 novels about quiet romance and 1 book of poetry. Though technically, I was asking for book recommendations disguised as relationship research. The honesty in his admission made her pulse quicken in a way that was becoming dangerously familiar. Research for what? For understanding how someone like you might want to be loved. The words hung in the air between them, more intimate than anything he'd said during their morning walks. Naomi felt her carefully constructed defenses wobble, then steady themselves through sheer force of habit. Someone like me, she repeated, not sure if it was a question or a statement. Someone thoughtful, cautious, someone who's been hurt before and isn't sure she wants to risk it again. Lysander's voice was gentle, but his eyes held hers with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. Someone who deserves to be loved like a favorite book, slowly, carefully, with attention to every beautiful detail. Naomi felt tears threaten behind her eyes. When was the last time someone had spoken to her like this? When was the last time someone had tried to understand her rather than change her? Lysander, she began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. Too much? He asked, reading her hesitation with the same careful attention he seemed to pay to everything about her. No, it's not. It's just... She looked down at the book still in her hands, using it as an anchor to steady herself. I'm not good at this. The slow falling part, the trusting part. I keep waiting for the moment when you realize I'm not worth the effort. Hey, Lysander stepped closer, gently tilting her chin up until she met his eyes again. What if I told you that effort isn't something I'm measuring? What if I told you that getting to know you, the real you, not some version you think I want to see, is the best part of my day? I'd probably tell you that you don't know me well enough to say that. Then give me the chance to know you better. The simple request felt monumental. Naomi thought about David, about how he'd started with similar words, but had ultimately wanted her to be smaller, quieter, more convenient. She thought about her mother's voice telling her to be practical, to choose security over sentiment. She thought about all the ways loving someone could go wrong. But then she looked at Lysander, really looked at him, at the way he held her gaze without trying to rush her decision, at the patient set of his shoulders, the books in his hands chosen specifically to understand her better, at the quiet confidence of someone who knew that good things took time. There's a cafe around the corner, she heard herself say. They have terrible coffee but excellent pastries and tables by the window where you can watch people walk by. Are you asking me on a date, Naomi Ellington? The teasing in his voice made her smile despite her nerves. I'm asking you if you want to continue this conversation somewhere with better lighting and worse coffee. I thought you'd never ask. As they walked toward the cafe together, their books tucked under their arms like shared secrets, Naomi realized that maybe loving someone didn't have to feel like jumping off a cliff. Maybe it could feel like walking into a bookstore on a quiet Saturday afternoon, purposeful, gentle, and full of endless possibilities waiting to be discovered. But as they settled into a corner table, and Lysander opened one of his books to a page he'd marked, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that she was still standing at the edge of something vast and uncertain, and that one wrong step could change everything. The worst moments always arrived disguised as ordinary ones. Naomi was standing in line at the grocery store on Tuesday evening, absently scanning headlines on magazine covers while waiting to pay for her modest collection of items: Greek yogurt, fresh spinach, the fancy dark chocolate she allowed herself once a week. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying Saturday's conversation with Lysander at the cafe, the way he'd listened to her talk about her abandoned writing dreams without trying to fix or minimize them. She was reaching for her wallet when she heard it, a laugh that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Well, well, Naomi Fletcher, or I suppose it's back to Ellington now, isn't it? She turned slowly, already knowing what she would find. David Hartwell stood 3 people behind her in line, his perfectly styled blonde hair and expensive suit exactly as she remembered them. But there was something new in his expression, a smugness that hadn't been there during their relationship, as if the past 3 years had confirmed everything he'd believed about her limitations. David, her voice came out steadier than she felt. What are you doing in Portland? Business meeting. I'm expanding the firm to the West Coast. He stepped closer, ignoring the irritated looks from other customers as he abandoned his place in line. You look exactly the same. Still shopping for one, I see. The comment hit its intended target. Naomi felt the familiar shame creep up her neck, the same feeling she'd carried for months after their engagement ended, the sense that her inability to be what he wanted somehow made her defective. Some things don't change, she managed, hating how small her voice sounded. No, they don't. David's eyes swept over her simple jeans and sweater with obvious disappointment. Still hiding away in your little apartment, still writing stories no one will ever read, still convinced that your feelings matter more than practical considerations. Each word was carefully chosen to wound, and they found their marks with surgical precision. This was the David she'd forgotten in the haze of missing him, not the charming man who'd swept her off her feet, but the one who'd slowly, methodically convinced her that her dreams were naive and her expectations unrealistic. Actually, Naomi said, surprised by the strength that crept into her voice, I'm doing quite well. I have a good job, good friends, a life I've built for myself. A marketing job, David said dismissively. We both know that's not what you really wanted. Remember all those late nights when you'd stay up writing instead of spending time with me? I told you then that it would never amount to anything, and here we are, 3 years later, proving me right. The grocery store suddenly felt too small, too bright, too full of witnesses to her humiliation. Naomi wanted to run, to disappear, to find somewhere safe where David's words couldn't follow her. Instead, she found herself thinking about Lysander's voice from Saturday afternoon. What if I told you that getting to know you, the real you, is the best part of my day? You're right, she said quietly, and David's smile widened in triumph. 3 years ago I let you convince me that my dreams didn't matter. I let you make me feel small and impractical and foolish for wanting something beyond what you thought I deserved. Naomi, but here's what you don't understand, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. I stopped writing because you made me believe I wasn't good enough. Not because I wasn't good enough, but because you needed me to believe it. And I'm finally starting to remember the difference. David's expression shifted from smugness to irritation. Don't be ridiculous. I was trying to help you be realistic about your limitations. No, you were trying to help yourself feel superior by making me smaller. Naomi picked up her grocery bag from the counter, surprised to realize her hands weren't shaking. The cashier had finished ringing up her items while they talked, and she handed over her card with steady fingers. You'll regret this attitude, David said, his voice taking on the sharp edge she remembered from their worst fights. You'll end up alone, just like I said you would. Who's going to want someone who puts imaginary stories ahead of real life? For a moment, the old fear rose in Naomi's throat. What if he was right? What if her cautious heart and broken dreams really did make her unlovable? But then she thought about morning walks in the park, about conversations that lasted for hours without either person checking their phone. She thought about someone who asked thoughtful questions about her work and listened to the answers like they mattered. She thought about books chosen specifically to understand her better, and eyes that saw her as someone worth knowing, rather than someone who needed to be fixed. Actually, she said, meeting David's gaze with something that felt remarkably like peace, I think I'm going to be just fine. She walked out of the store without looking back, leaving David standing in the checkout line with his mouth slightly open and his certainty shaken. The October evening air felt crisp and clean against her skin, washing away the claustrophobic feeling of the past few minutes. Her phone buzzed as she unlocked her car. A text from Lysander. Hope your day ended better than it started. See you tomorrow morning for our walk? Naomi stared at the message for a long moment, remembering David's prediction about ending up alone. Then she typed back, Definitely. I have some things I'd like to tell you. As she drove home through the quiet Portland streets, Naomi realized that running into David hadn't been the worst moment after all. It had been exactly what she needed, a reminder of who she used to be when she let someone else define her worth, and a glimpse of who she was becoming when she remembered how to define it herself. But the real test, she knew, would come tomorrow morning when she tried to explain to Lysander why her hands were still trembling and her heart was still raw from reopening old wounds. The morning air tasted like rain and second chances. Naomi arrived at the park 15 minutes early, her stomach churning with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She'd barely slept, replaying her encounter with David and rehearsing different versions of how to tell Lysander about it. Every imagined conversation ended the same way, with him realizing that she came with too much baggage, too many complications, too much history that could complicate whatever was growing between them. She found their usual bench by the pond and sat down, watching the ducks glide across the water with their effortless grace. How did they make it look so easy, this business of moving forward without looking back? "You're here early." Lysander's voice made her turn, and she felt her heart do that familiar flutter when she saw him approaching, with 2 coffee cups from Brewed Awakening. He was wearing a forest green jacket that brought out the blue in his eyes, and his hair was slightly damp from the morning mist. "I brought reinforcements," he said, offering her one of the cups. "Figured we might need caffeine for whatever serious conversation is brewing behind those thoughtful eyes of yours." Naomi accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup and using the gesture to buy herself a few more seconds of courage. "How did you know I needed to have a serious conversation? Your text last night had a certain weight to it. Plus, you've been sitting here for at least 10 minutes staring at those ducks like they might have answers to life's biggest questions." Despite her nervousness, Naomi smiled. Maybe they do. They seem to have figured out how to move through life without constantly second-guessing themselves. Lysander settled beside her on the bench, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his jacket. "Want to tell me what happened yesterday?" The gentle question, asked without pressure or impatience, made something tight in Naomi's chest begin to loosen. She took a sip of coffee, perfectly prepared with just the right amount of cream, and marveled at how well he was already learning her preferences. "I ran into my ex-fiancé at the grocery store," she said, the words tumbling out before she could lose her nerve. "David, the one I mentioned during our walk." Lysander didn't react with surprise or jealousy, just waited for her to continue with the same patient attention she'd come to treasure. "He said some things," Naomi continued, staring down at her coffee, "about how I haven't changed, how I'm still the same impractical dreamer who thinks her feelings matter more than reality, about how I'll end up alone because I put imaginary stories ahead of real life." "And what did you say?" The question surprised her. Most people would have immediately reassured her that David was wrong, or gotten angry on her behalf, or tried to fix her feelings about the encounter. Lysander simply wanted to know how she had responded. "I told him he was wrong, that I had stopped writing because he made me believe I wasn't good enough, not because I actually wasn't good enough." She looked up at Lysander, searching his face for signs of judgment or concern. "But Lysander, what if he was right about some things? What if I am too complicated, too damaged from what happened between us? Can I tell you what I see when I look at you?" Lysander asked softly. Naomi nodded, not trusting her voice. "I see someone who chooses kindness, even when the world hasn't always been kind to her. Someone who notices the way light falls through coffee shop windows and remembers the details of other people's stories. Someone brave enough to get up every morning and try again, even when trying feels scary." He shifted on the bench, so he was facing her more directly. "I see someone who was told she was too much by someone who was actually too little." Tears threatened behind Naomi's eyes. "But what if there are more Davids in my past? What if I bring complications into your life that you don't deserve?" "Naomi," Lysander said, his voice gentle but firm, "everyone has complications. Everyone has moments they wish they could undo, people who hurt them, parts of their story they'd rather skip over. That's not damage. That's life." He reached over and took her free hand, intertwining their fingers with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "Besides," he continued, "I'm not looking for someone perfect. I'm looking for someone real, someone who knows that love isn't about finding someone without scars. It's about finding someone whose scars fit with yours in ways that make both of you stronger." "That's a very romantic way to think about emotional baggage," Naomi said, managing a watery smile. "I prefer to think of it as emotional luggage. Much more dignified." The joke was gentle enough to make her laugh without minimizing the seriousness of the moment. Naomi looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how natural it felt, how right. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. "Of what?" "Of letting you in, and then having you realize I'm not worth the effort. Of falling for you, and then discovering that you're just better at hiding your expectations than David was. Of trusting my heart again and having it broken worse than before." Lysander squeezed her hand gently. "Those are all reasonable fears, and I can't promise you that loving me won't involve risk. All love does. But I can promise you that I will never ask you to be smaller to make me feel bigger. I can promise that your dreams matter to me because they matter to you, and I can promise that if you decide to trust me with your heart, I will treat it like the precious thing it is." Naomi felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, like a door that had been locked for 3 years, finally clicking open. "What are you saying exactly?" "I'm saying that I'm already falling for you, Naomi Ellington. I'm saying that your complications don't scare me. They make you who you are. And who you are is exactly who I want to know better. He brought their joined hands up to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles. I'm saying that if you're brave enough to try, I'd like to see where this goes. As the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting everything in golden light, Naomi realized that courage didn't have to be a grand gesture. Sometimes it was as simple as saying yes to the possibility of happiness, even when you couldn't guarantee the outcome. I think, she said softly, I'd like to see where this goes too. But even as she spoke the words, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that wanting something and being ready for it weren't always the same thing. Some silences were louder than words. Naomi sat across from Lysander at a small Italian restaurant he'd chosen for their first official date, watching him explain the difference between various pasta shapes with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. The candlelight flickered across his face, highlighting the laugh lines around his eyes and the way his hands moved expressively when he talked about things that mattered to him. It should have been perfect. The restaurant was intimate without being pretentious. The conversation flowed easily, and Lysander had arrived with a small bouquet of white tulips, her favorite flower, which she'd mentioned in passing during one of their morning walks 3 weeks ago. He remembered everything, noticed everything, treated every detail about her like it was worth preserving. So why did she feel like she was watching the evening from outside herself, like she was playing the role of a woman on a date, rather than actually being one? You're somewhere else tonight, Lysander observed gently, setting down his fork and giving her his full attention. Everything okay? Naomi blinked, realizing she'd been absently moving her linguine around her plate for the past several minutes. Sorry, I'm just processing, I guess. Processing what? The question was asked without judgment, but Naomi felt the familiar urge to deflect, to smile and change the subject to something safer. Instead, she found herself being honest again, a habit that was becoming both easier and more terrifying around him. This, she said, gesturing between them, us. The fact that I'm sitting in a beautiful restaurant with a man who remembers that I like tulips and asks thoughtful questions about my work, and instead of feeling grateful or happy, I feel like I'm waiting for something to go wrong. Lysander leaned back in his chair, considering her words. What kind of wrong? I don't know. Maybe you'll realize that I'm not as interesting as you thought I was during our coffee shop conversations. Maybe I'll say something that reveals how deeply fucked up I still am about relationships. Maybe... She stopped herself, aware that she was spiraling. Maybe you're scared that if you let yourself enjoy this, you'll have further to fall if it doesn't work out, Lysander finished quietly. The accuracy of his observation made her chest tighten. Is it that obvious? Only because I've been there. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. After my grandmother died 5 years ago, I went through a phase where I couldn't let myself get attached to anything. Not places, not routines, not people. Because if I didn't care too much, it couldn't hurt too much when I inevitably lost it. How did you get past that? I realized that the alternative to risking loss was guaranteeing emptiness. His thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. And I decided that even if loving something meant I might lose it, at least I would have had the experience of loving it at all. Naomi stared down at their joined hands, feeling the warmth of his skin against hers. What if I'm not ready? What if I want to be the kind of person who can take emotional risks, but I'm just not there yet? Then we go slowly, Lysander said simply. We take it one day at a time, one conversation at a time, one morning walk at a time. There's no timeline for this, Naomi. No schedule we have to follow. But what if slowly isn't enough? What if I need so much time and patience that you eventually get tired of waiting for me to catch up? The question hung between them, heavy with all her accumulated fears about being too much work, too complicated, too damaged to be worth the effort. Naomi held her breath, waiting for him to reassure her in a way that would feel hollow or worse, to hesitate in a way that would confirm her worst fears. Instead, Lysander was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Can I tell you about my grandmother's garden? He asked finally. The apparent non sequitur caught Naomi off guard. Sure. She had this rose bush that she planted the year my grandfather died. It was supposed to bloom that first spring, but it didn't. The second year, nothing. By the third year, my neighbors were telling her to dig it up, that it was obviously a dud, that she was wasting space that could be used for something more reliable. Naomi found herself leaning forward, drawn into the story, despite her confusion about its relevance. But my grandmother kept tending it, Lysander continued, watering it, pruning it, talking to it like it could hear her, And in the 4th year, it bloomed. Not just a few flowers. The whole bush exploded with the most beautiful roses any of us had ever seen. Deep red, perfectly formed, with a fragrance that filled her entire backyard. Why are you telling me this? Because some of the most beautiful things take time to bloom, and the people who are worth loving are usually the ones who've learned to be careful about where they put down roots. He squeezed her hand gently. I'm not waiting for you to catch up, Naomi. I'm growing alongside you. Tears threatened behind her eyes. But what if I never bloom? What if I'm just stuck in this in-between place where I want to love you, but I'm too afraid to let myself? Then we'll figure it out together. But honestly, I think you're already blooming. You just can't see it yet because you're too close to the process. Naomi looked around the restaurant, at the couples sharing quiet conversations, at the soft lighting that made everything feel dreamlike, at the man across from her who somehow saw potential in her damaged heart. For just a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to stop watching for exits and start believing in possibilities. I want to try, she said softly. To bloom, I mean. To let myself believe that this could work. That's all I'm asking for, Lysander said. Just try. We'll figure out the rest as we go. As they left the restaurant hand in hand, walking slowly through the quiet Portland streets, Naomi felt something shift inside her chest. Not a complete transformation. She wasn't naive enough to believe that one conversation could undo years of careful self-protection, but maybe a small crack in the wall she'd built around her heart, just enough to let in a little light. But even as she squeezed Lysander's hand and allowed herself to enjoy the feeling of walking beside him, a small voice whispered that wanting to change and actually changing weren't the same thing, and that the real test would come when her old patterns inevitably tried to pull her back to safety. The text message sat on her phone screen like an accusation. Haven't heard from you in 3 days. Everything okay? Naomi stared at Lysander's words from her position curled up on her apartment couch, wrapped in the oversized sweater that had become her armor against the world. 3 days. Had it really been 3 days since she'd responded to his messages, since she'd shown up for their morning walk, since she'd allowed herself to believe that she could be the kind of person who didn't run when things got too real? The realization hit her with sickening clarity. She was doing it again. The slow retreat, the gradual pulling away, the careful construction of distance that had become her default response when anyone got too close. It was exactly what she'd done with her college friends when they started asking too many questions about her relationship with David. Exactly what she'd done with her co-workers when they'd invited her to after-work drinks one too many times. The pattern was so familiar, she could have navigated it with her eyes closed. First, the panic when someone started to matter too much. Then, the small withdrawals, missed calls, delayed responses, excuses that sounded reasonable but felt hollow. Finally, the complete disappearance executed so gradually that by the time the other person noticed, it was already too late to bridge the gap she'd created. But this time felt different. This time, she could see herself doing it. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Lysander. No pressure to respond, just want you to know I'm here when you're ready. The kindness in his words made her chest ache. Of course he wasn't pushing. Of course he was giving her space. Of course he was being exactly the sort of patient, understanding man who deserved better than someone who disappeared the moment things got complicated. Naomi pulled her knees up to her chest and tried to remember when exactly she'd started running. It had been so gradual she hadn't noticed it happening. After their dinner date 5 days ago, she'd felt hopeful, optimistic even. They'd walked through the city holding hands, and she'd allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to stop being afraid. But then she'd gone home to her quiet apartment, and the silence had felt different somehow. Not peaceful, but expectant, like it was waiting for her to ruin what she'd started to build. Like it knew something about her that Lysander hadn't figured out yet. The thoughts had started small, tiny whispers of doubt that grew louder each day. What if he's just being polite? What if he's already getting tired of having to reassure you all the time? What if David was right, and you really are too complicated for anyone to love long-term? By the second day, she'd convinced herself that she needed space to think. By the third, she'd started crafting elaborate scenarios in which Lysander would be relieved to be free of her emotional baggage. By today, she'd almost convinced herself that disappearing was actually a kindness, a way of sparing him the inevitable disappointment of discovering who she really was underneath all her careful masks. But sitting here now, reading his gentle messages, Naomi realized that her old patterns weren't protecting anyone. They were just another form of self-sabotage, dressed up as self-preservation. Her phone rang, startling her out of her spiral. Lysander's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment she considered letting it go to voicemail, like she had for the past 2 days. Instead, she found herself answering. "Hi," she said quietly. "Hi yourself." His voice was warm, relieved, without a trace of the frustration he had every right to feel. "How are you doing?" The simple question nearly undid her. "Honestly, I'm doing that thing where I sabotage something good before it has a chance to hurt me." "Ah," Lysander said, and she could hear the understanding in his voice. "Want to talk about it?" "I don't know if talking will help. I think this might just be who I am, someone who runs when things get too real." "Or maybe," Lysander said gently, "you're someone who's been hurt before and is trying to protect herself the only way she knows how. Those aren't the same thing." Naomi felt tears threatening. But what if they are? What if this pattern is so ingrained that I can't change it even when I want to? Then we figure out how to work with it instead of against it. Maybe instead of fighting the impulse to run, we create a safe space for you to retreat to when you need it. Maybe we build trust slowly enough that running doesn't feel like the only option. You make it sound so simple. It's not simple, Lysander admitted, but it's possible. The question is whether you want to try, or whether you've already decided that it's easier to end this before it gets more complicated. The question hung between them, and Naomi realized that this was her moment of choice. She could continue the familiar pattern, make excuses, create distance, let this fade away like every other relationship that had gotten too close to her heart. Or she could do something that terrified her. She could stay. "I want to try," she whispered. "But I'm scared that I'll just do this again, that I'll keep pulling away every time we get closer, until you finally get tired of it." "What if we started smaller?" Lysander suggested. "Instead of expecting yourself to be completely open all the time, what if we just focused on not disappearing completely? What if when you feel the urge to run, you just tell me that's what you're feeling? That simple? That simple. No judgment, no pressure to explain or fix it. Just honesty about where you are in the moment." Naomi closed her eyes, imagining what it would feel like to have that kind of safety net, to know that she could admit to being scared without having to defend her fear or apologize for it. "I'm feeling it right now," she said softly. "The urge to run, to hang up this phone and convince myself that you deserve better than someone who needs this much patience." "Thank you for telling me," Lysander said simply. What would help right now? Space, company, something in between? The fact that he was asking rather than deciding for her made something tight in her chest begin to loosen. "Could we maybe take a walk? Nothing heavy, just walking. I think better when I'm moving. I'll pick you up in 20 minutes. As Naomi hung up the phone and went to find her shoes, she realized that maybe change didn't have to be a dramatic transformation. Maybe it could be as simple as choosing again and again to stay instead of run, even when staying felt like the scariest thing she'd ever done. The rain had started again, but this time Naomi didn't mind getting wet. She and Lysander walked side by side through the empty streets of her neighborhood, their footsteps splashing through puddles that reflected the warm glow of streetlights. The October air was sharp and clean, washing away the claustrophobic feeling that had been building in her apartment over the past 3 days. "Tell me about the first time you remember wanting to run," Lysander said quietly, his hands tucked deep in his jacket pockets. It wasn't the question she'd expected, and Naomi found herself considering it seriously instead of deflecting. "I was 7, she said after a moment. "My parents had this huge fight, screaming, throwing things, the whole dramatic mess. I hid in my closet until it got quiet, and when I came out, my dad was gone. Just gone. No explanation, no goodbye. Did he come back 3 days later, like nothing had happened? But during those 3 days, I kept thinking that if I'd been a better daughter, maybe he wouldn't have left. Maybe if I'd been quieter, or gotten better grades, or needed less attention." She shrugged, surprised by how easily the words were coming. "I guess I learned early that people leave, and it's usually because you've asked for too much." Lysander stopped walking and turned to face her, rain droplets catching in his hair like tiny diamonds. "And so you started leaving first." It seemed logical at the time. Naomi managed a rueful smile. "If you don't let anyone get close enough to disappoint you, you never have to deal with the aftermath. Except the aftermath of leaving is loneliness." Loneliness felt safer than abandonment. They resumed walking, and Naomi felt something shift in the space between them. Not the desperate intimacy of someone trying too hard to connect, but the quiet understanding of someone who had learned to listen to the stories hidden beneath the surface. "What about you?" she asked. "When did you learn to stay?" Lysander was quiet for so long that Naomi wondered if he'd heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain carefully processed. After my grandmother died, I went through a phase where I dated women who were obviously wrong for me, not because I didn't know better, but because I knew they'd leave eventually, and that felt easier than risking real loss again. He kicked at a small stone, sending it skittering ahead of them. It took me about 2 years to realize that I was doing exactly what you're doing, protecting myself right into isolation. What changed? I met a woman named Claire. She was smart, funny, completely inappropriate for me in every practical way, and absolutely perfect for me in every way that mattered. Lysander's smile was soft with memory. She lasted about 3 months before she called me out on my emotional unavailability. Naomi felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy. What happened to her? She moved to Seattle for a job opportunity, but before she left, she told me something that stuck. She said that love isn't about finding someone who will never leave you. It's about finding someone worth staying for, even when staying is scary. They had reached the small park at the end of Naomi's street, where a single bench sat beneath an old oak tree. Despite the rain, they settled onto it, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Is that what this is?" Naomi asked softly. "You staying because I'm worth it?" "I'm staying because we're worth it," Lysander corrected. "Because what we're building together is worth the risk of it not working out. Because even if this doesn't last forever, I'd rather have loved you imperfectly than never have loved you at all." The words hit Naomi like a physical blow, not because they hurt, but because they were exactly what she'd been afraid to hope for. Someone who saw her patterns, her flaws, her tendency to run and chose to stay anyway, not because he thought he could fix her, but because he thought she was worth the effort of growing alongside. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, tears mixing with raindrops on her cheeks. "I don't know how to be the kind of person who stays when things get difficult. Then we'll learn together." Lysander reached over and took her hand, intertwining their fingers with the same gentle certainty she'd come to associate with everything he did. "We'll take it one day at a time, one conversation at a time, and when you feel like running, you'll tell me, and we'll figure out what you need to feel safe staying. What if I disappoint you? What if I keep pulling away, even when I don't want to? Then we'll try again tomorrow, and the day after that, for as long as it takes." He turned to face her fully, his blue-gray eyes serious in the dim light. "Naomi, I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm not asking you to never be scared or confused or damaged. I'm just asking you to try to trust that I meant it when I said I want to know the real you. All of you, including the parts that are still healing." Naomi looked at their joined hands, at the way his thumb traced gentle circles on her palm, at the rain falling around them like a blessing. For the first time in years, maybe in her entire life, she felt seen without feeling exposed, known without feeling judged. "I want to try," she said, the words barely audible above the sound of rain on leaves. "I want to learn how to stay." "Then that's enough," Lysander said simply. "That's more than enough." As they sat together on that rain-soaked bench, Naomi felt something fundamental shift inside her. Not a complete transformation. She wasn't naive enough to believe that one conversation could undo a lifetime of learned responses, but for the first time, she felt like staying might be possible, like love might be possible, like she might be possible. The rain continued to fall, but neither of them moved to leave. They sat in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, learning that sometimes the most radical act of courage isn't running toward something new, but sitting still long enough to let something real take root. But even as she squeezed Lysander's hand and allowed herself to believe in the possibility of permanence, a small part of Naomi whispered that the real test would come not in moments like this, quiet and perfect and removed from the world, but in the bright light of ordinary days, when the choice to stay would have to be made again and again, without the romance of rain and the poetry of night, to make it feel easy. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other. Naomi was sitting at her kitchen table, laptop open to a client presentation she was supposed to finish before noon, when she saw the elegant envelope mixed in with her usual stack of bills and advertisements. Her name was written in calligraphy that belonged in wedding announcements or formal events, the kind of script that made ordinary people feel important. Inside was an invitation to the Portland Literary Arts Foundation Gala, scheduled for the following Saturday. The same foundation where she'd met Lysander 2 months ago, in what now felt like another lifetime. But this invitation was different from the one Bethany had pressed into her hands back then. This one was addressed specifically to her, with a handwritten note at the bottom. We would be honored to have you join us as a featured emerging writer. Your submission has been selected for our Spotlight program. Naomi stared at the words until they blurred. Submission? She hadn't submitted anything to anyone in over 3 years. The last time she'd shared her writing with strangers, David had spent an entire evening explaining why pursuing publication was setting herself up for disappointment and why she should focus on more realistic goals. Her phone rang, startling her out of her confusion. Lysander's name appeared on the screen and she answered automatically. "Good morning, beautiful." His warm voice filled her kitchen, making her smile despite her bewilderment. "How's the presentation coming along?" "Lysander," she said, still staring at the invitation, "did you submit my writing to the Literary Arts Foundation?" Silence stretched between them, long enough that Naomi could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. "Yes," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "I did." The admission hit her like a physical blow. "How? When? I never gave you permission to—" "That night 3 weeks ago when you fell asleep on my couch, after we'd been talking about your abandoned novel, you left your laptop open and I saw the document titled Stories Worth Telling. I only read the first few pages, but Naomi—" His voice carried a mixture of awe and determination. "They were beautiful, heartbreaking and real, and exactly the kind of work that deserves to be seen." Naomi felt her chest tighten with a familiar panic. "You had no right. Those stories are private, they're not ready, they're not good enough." "Stop." Lysander's voice cut through her spiral with gentle firmness. "Don't you dare diminish your talent because someone once convinced you it wasn't worth sharing." "This isn't about David," Naomi said, even as she recognized the lie in her own words. "This is about you making decisions about my life without asking me. This is about you thinking you know what's best for me better than I do." "You're right," Lysander said immediately. "I should have asked. I should have talked to you first, gotten your permission, respected your boundaries. I was wrong to submit your work without telling you." His immediate admission of fault should have made her feel better, but instead it made her angrier. At least when David had tried to control her choices, he'd had the courtesy to argue about it. Lysander's easy acknowledgement of his mistake somehow made it worse, like he was managing her emotions instead of engaging with them. "I need to see you," she said abruptly. "Right now. We need to talk about this face to face." "Of course. I'll come to you, or we can meet somewhere. The park, our bench, 20 minutes. Naomi hung up without waiting for his response and sat staring at the invitation that had upended her carefully controlled morning. Part of her wanted to be grateful. Her work had been selected, recognized, deemed worthy of spotlighting at an event that could change her career trajectory. But a larger part of her felt exposed, vulnerable, like someone had taken her diary and published it in the newspaper without warning. The walk to the park felt longer than usual, her mind racing through different versions of the conversation she was about to have. By the time she reached their bench, Lysander was already there, looking uncharacteristically uncertain as he watched her approach. "Before you say anything," she said, sitting down, but maintaining careful distance between them, "I need you to understand something. For 3 years I have made every decision about my life based on what I thought I could handle. Every risk I've taken, every opportunity I've passed up, every dream I've put aside. All of it has been my choice, even when those choices hurt." Lysander nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "And yes, maybe some of those choices were influenced by fear or past trauma, or David's voice in my head telling me I wasn't good enough, but they were still my choices to make." Naomi's voice grew stronger as she continued. "When you submitted my work without asking, you took that choice away from me. You decided that you knew better than I did what I was ready for." "You're absolutely right," Lysander said quietly. "And I'm sorry. Not just sorry that you're upset, but sorry that I crossed a line I shouldn't have crossed." "Why did you do it?" Lysander was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the pond where their familiar ducks glided across the surface. "Because I love you," he said finally. "Because I've watched you dim your own light for weeks, talking about your writing like it's something shameful instead of something extraordinary. Because I wanted you to see yourself the way I see you." The words should have melted her anger, but instead they sharpened it into something cleaner and more focused. "You don't get to love me by making decisions for me," Naomi said, her voice steady and clear. "You don't get to save me from my own choices, even when you think those choices are wrong. Especially when you think those choices are wrong. I know. I understand that now, but—" "No." Naomi stood up, needing the physical distance to think clearly. "There's no but here, Lysander. Either you respect my autonomy completely or you don't respect me at all. There's no middle ground. Lysander rose to face her, his expression pained but determined. So what are you saying? That this is over? That one mistake means we can't find a way forward? Naomi looked at him, really looked at him, at the man who had shown her what it felt like to be truly seen, who had taught her that love didn't have to feel like losing herself. The man who had also just proven that even the most well-intentioned love could become another form of control if she wasn't careful. I'm saying, she said slowly, that I need you to understand that I get to decide what risks I'm ready for. I get to choose when to share my writing, when to take opportunities, when to put myself out there. And if you can't accept that, if you're going to keep trying to push me toward what you think is best for me, then we can't do this. And if I can accept it, if I promise to never make decisions about your life without consulting you first. Naomi felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking but expanding. Then I'm going to that gala on Saturday night, not because you submitted my work, and not because some foundation thinks I'm worth spotlighting, but because I'm choosing to go, because I'm ready to find out what happens when I stop hiding from my own potential. Lysander's face lit up with hope and pride, and something that looked remarkably like relief. You're going to be amazing. Maybe, Naomi said, allowing herself a small smile. Or maybe I'll be terrible and awkward and completely out of my depth. But either way, it will be my choice to find out. As they walked back toward her apartment, hands carefully not touching but hearts somehow more connected than before, Naomi realized that this was what real love looked like, not someone trying to save you from yourself, but someone standing beside you while you learned to save yourself. 6 months later, the morning light filtered through the windows of Naomi's new apartment with the kind of golden warmth that made ordinary moments feel extraordinary. She stood in her kitchen, coffee mug in hand, watching Lysander arrange fresh tulips in the vase they'd bought together at the Saturday farmers market. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, the same careful attention he brought to everything from designing living spaces to learning the exact way she liked her coffee prepared. 6 months had passed since the Literary Arts Foundation Gala, since the night she'd stood on a small stage and read her work to a room full of strangers who had listened with the kind of attention that felt like recognition. 6 months since she'd learned that her voice, her real voice, not the one she'd carefully modulated to avoid taking up too much space, was worth hearing. The gala had led to other opportunities. A small literary magazine wanted to publish her short story collection, a local writing group had invited her to join their monthly workshops, and last week she'd received an email from an agent who'd heard her read and wanted to discuss representation for the novel she'd been afraid to finish. But more than the external validation, more than the slowly building career she'd once thought impossible, what had changed was simpler and more profound. She had learned to take up space without apologizing for it. "What are you thinking about?" Lysander asked, noticing her contemplative silence. "How different this feels," Naomi said, gesturing to the sunlit kitchen, to him arranging flowers with the same care he brought to everything, to the manuscript pages scattered across her small dining table. 6 months ago, I would have been waiting for something to go wrong, for you to realize I was too much work, or for my writing to be rejected, or for this feeling of contentment to reveal itself as temporary. And now I'm just here, present, not looking over my shoulder for the next disaster or trying to control outcomes I can't predict." She set down her coffee mug and moved closer to him, close enough to smell the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with morning air. "I'm learning to trust the process instead of trying to manage it," Lysander smiled, the expression that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection. "That sounds like growth. That sounds terrifying," Naomi corrected with a laugh. "But good terrifying. The kind that means you're expanding instead of shrinking." They had learned over these months how to navigate the space between independence and intimacy. Lysander had kept his promise about never making decisions for her again, even when it meant watching her struggle with choices he could have easily simplified. Naomi had learned to communicate her needs before they became emergencies, to ask for support without feeling like she was imposing. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when her old patterns tried to reassert themselves, days when she felt the familiar urge to create distance before things got too real. But now she had tools for those moments, and more importantly, she had someone who understood that healing wasn't linear and growth wasn't always graceful. "I have something for you," Lysander said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a small wrapped package. Naomi raised an eyebrow. It's not my birthday, or any kind of special occasion that I'm aware of. It's a Tuesday in April, and you finished the first draft of your novel yesterday, and you're wearing that smile that means you've just realized something important about yourself. He handed her the package with characteristic gentleness. That seems like occasion enough. Inside the wrapping was a small leather journal, worn soft with age, with her initials embossed in gold on the cover. It was my grandmother's, Lysander explained. She used it to write down things she wanted to remember, recipes, quotes, observations, about the way light changed throughout the seasons. I thought maybe you could use it for your own observations. Naomi ran her fingers over the smooth leather, feeling the weight of history and possibility in her hands. Are you sure? This seems like something you should keep. She would have wanted it to go to another writer, someone who understands that words have power. He touched her hand gently. Besides, I have plenty of her other things, but this feels like it belongs with you. As Naomi opened the journal to the first blank page, she realized that this was what love looked like when it was healthy, not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but small acts of recognition and support that helped you become more yourself, not less. Thank you, she said, standing on her toes to kiss him softly, for this, and for learning how to love me without trying to fix me. Thank you, he replied, for teaching me the difference. Later that morning, as Lysander left for work, and Naomi settled at her table with the new journal and her laptop, she wrote her first entry. Today, I woke up in a life I chose instead of a life that happened to me. It's taken me 29 years and more false starts than I care to count, but I'm finally learning that the most radical act isn't loving someone perfectly. It's allowing yourself to be loved imperfectly, completely, as exactly who you are. She paused, pen hovering over the page, then added, some love stories don't begin with fireworks. Some begin with a quiet recognition, like finding a book you didn't know you were looking for. And some stories, the ones worth telling, are about learning that you don't have to be fixed to be loved. You just have to be brave enough to let someone see who you really are underneath all the careful protecting. This is my story of learning to stay. Outside her window, Portland was waking up to another ordinary Tuesday, full of coffee shops and morning commutes and small moments that could change everything if you were paying attention. And for the first time in her life, Naomi Ellington was present for all of it. The beautiful, the mundane, the uncertain, and the hopeful. She was finally, completely home. What would you do if someone you loved made a decision about your life without asking you first? Even if their intentions were good, would you be able to forgive them and rebuild trust? Share your thoughts about love, boundaries, and second chances below. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.